Hi, this is Manny Chopra here, and I am here with Alex. Sorry, I can't pronounce your surname, Alex. Apologies for that. But Alex is the founder of SaveTheHighStreet.org. So, welcome, Alex.
Thank you very much for having me, Manny.
So the objective of this call really is to know a little bit more about what Save the High Street do, help you get the word out there, and more also towards the end of the call, find out about how we as SME property developers can help you in saving the high street.
Okay. Okay.
So do you want to kick off with maybe giving us a bit of background about yourself and what
Okay.
does Save the High Street do?
Yeah, happy to. So, for those that don't know, SaveTheHighStreet.org is an industry-wide movement. We're on a mission to ensure the success of UK high streets. We're running a whole series of programs that are all focused around, ensuring a better connected, more vibrant, more sustainable high street economy. And those campaigns and programs, they're all in partnership with different stakeholders across the high street, because ultimately the success or failure of high streets really does impact us all. You know, from from a commercial point of view, we're talking about 500,000 outlets. There's a lot of those are independently owned, so lots of livelihoods at stake here.
Yeah.
From a retail property point of view, this is a 337 billion pound market in the UK alone. It's the largest asset class in commercial property. And ultimately, as largely talked about, high streets power the local economy, and they're really the juice that really keeps the local community thriving as well. So there's a lot of factors, that influence whether a high street is successful or not, and as a result, that there's lots of different stakeholders involved. So as an industry-wide movement, part of the premise here is we sort of bring everybody together into this conversation and into the different work that needs to be done, because the success or failure of high streets doesn't just impact us all. We all have a part to play, and the more of us that get involved in this, ultimately, the stronger we all become. So, some of the work we're doing is really at the grassroots level. We're running a whole series of programs, campaigns. We have technology that goes into the tenants, into the businesses themselves, tracks their performance, gives them recommendations to improve. Historically, a lot of work going on around footfall and sales, and now we've got a whole program of support for the independent high street businesses to get them through this crisis that everyone's in at the moment. We work with the local community champions, who can be anyone from a business improvement district to a trader association to a community group to a local councillor, and work in partnership with the local authority and those community associations to put in place plans for individual high streets. To really look at what can this high street be? What should this high street be doing right now? And what factors need to be put in place to make this high street successful? And then there's a whole bunch of stuff that's slightly more national, where we really look at, running national campaigns to educate the market, to inform the market. And even though we don't call ourselves a lobbyist, indirectly, we're championing the causes that we want to get behind and trying to drive change on the high street to ensure we have a successful future high street.
Very, very interesting, Alex. And, I'll just give you an example. So I don't live too far away from the Slough High Street, which is not in a very great condition. Let's put it that way. But, our interest is also in the fact that our house prices depend on the local high street. So, changing the high street will change and increase your property prices by how many of a percentage that is, right? And another example is Bracknell High Street, which was very recently, I think they invested millions, hundreds of millions of pounds, and that completely changed that particular high street, right? So I think we all have a vested interest in it. And so I understand where you're coming from. And I know we've had challenges in keeping this high street up and running. And you are obviously doing a lot in the background, which a lot of us don't know about. So, obviously now with this lockdown and everything's come to a complete halt, do you think that's going to change the face of the high street going forward? And how, as SME developers, can we bring about or be instrument or catalyst for that change?
Fantastic. I'll address that question, but let me just pick up on one point you made there, because I think it's a really important point that everybody realizes here. So the reasons we want to live in some places and not others is to do with, thriving, diverse high streets. And actually some really forward-thinking developers that have got around some of the fragmented ownership challenges, which we can talk about at some point. But some of those guys, they're thinking much more about how do I turn this high street into a destination so that I can push up the value of my residential property assets around it. I mean,
Yeah.
the Marylebone project with De Walden, very good example of this long-term vision around how do I invest in curating a great high street so that I can actually have great value and returns from my residential assets all around the high street. So I think it's a really important point, and there's certain knowledge we have and insight we've got around the Bracknell projects doing similar kind of logics there as well. So that's one point I thought was a very, very interesting perspective there. Now your question, man, is also a good one. So, I mean, I think firstly the reality is that even on the other side of this, yeah, the high street will never be the same again. Now, what we're in at the moment is the most disruptive, challenging, transformative period in the entire history of high streets. And it's interesting because we were sort of talking that language 3 years ago when SaveTheHighStreet.org kicked off. It launched in August 2016. And I was saying back then, this is the most transformational period in the history of the high street. Well, it wasn't. Now it is.
Clearly.
Quite clear. You know, March 2020 was the most transformational period in the history of high streets. Now, you know, huge disruption, absolutely no doubt, you know, and, you know, really, I mean, if we look at it today, you know, the worst case scenario for the future of the high street is playing out for all of us to experience. You know, much of the high street is closed. Many of the high streets have turned into ghost towns. Now, that doesn't mean that the future of the high street needs to look like that. The future of the high street is actually dependent on what we all do now. Yeah, that what influences the future, not what we're doing, what's happening right now. So, what do we think about the future here? So, I think the reality is everyone, as I said before, has a role to play here, and government has stepped up. I mean, government is throwing money at the high street economy, and we can talk a little bit more about what more needs to be done with the landlords on the high street, because you know what we're seeing here a lot of the time is there's a tripartite relationship going on between landlord, lender, and tenant. Yeah, and actually, where we need to see more support, and I'd like to see a lot more lobbying type support happening, is to support the landlord in a lot of these relationships here, because tenants are not able to pay the same rental income as before, and landlords can't and are not in a position, the SME landlord sector just aren't in a position to pick up the slack. And in fact, a lot of the big institutional landlords are not in a position to pick up the slack. I mean, we've got some seriously high risk institutional landlords out there at the moment. I'm sure we're all aware of.
Pension funds
So,
and things, right? Yeah, absolutely.
so I think so ultimately what the future holds, yeah, it depends on what we do now. So businesses have a lot of things to do and on the high street. So the independent high street businesses, we've got a program of support which has got various different tiers. Some of it's free, some of it's premium. And within that support package, we're looking at everything from how do you reduce your costs? You know, how do you sell through different channels in different ways? How do you market during lockdown? Regardless of whether you're open or not, you should still be engaging your existing customers,
Yeah,
even if you're not out there looking for new ones.
yeah.
You know, how do you work collaboratively as a community during this period here? And there's lots of things you should be doing in there. How do you prepare for the future? And how do you look for financing support, funding support for your business? Now, all of those 6 goals, as we call them,
Yeah.
have dozens and dozens of ideas that you could be putting in place for your business. So first thing, the businesses themselves on the high street should not be sitting at home just watching Netflix,
Yeah.
furloughing their staff. They should
Yeah.
be working on their business, even if they're not in their business operating it day to day. That's the first thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And how do they, for this, how do they access the wealth of information that you've got out there for them to do all these 7 things?
Well, firstly, join SaveTheHighStreet.org. It's free for anybody listening in. You should join Save the High Street because it's a movement for everybody.
Yeah,
Go onto the website, register for the movement, join the newsletter, follow
yeah,
us on social.
yeah.
You know, there's new stuff coming out all the
All
time.
that. Yeah, absolutely.
So that's a good start for that. And businesses can find more information through there about how they get involved in different levels of support and landlords as well. So there's lots of different things we're doing. It's not just about the businesses. So with local authorities, there's lots of different things that we're looking at now. Firstly, we're looking to get them out of that zone of, right, they've applied the grants now. Now's time to plan for the future. Now's time to get your high streets fit and ready to be successful in the
Yes.
future. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of things. So we've got some discrete solutions that we're working on with certain landlords at the moment. Some of it's about making sure all their businesses have business supports. That's
Yeah.
one thing. Another thing is about putting delivery in across high streets. So
Yeah.
we're partnering with local couriers across the UK to put in local to local delivery solutions on a high street level. So there's certain times, whether it's every day or certain times of the week for smaller high streets, couriers arrive, pick up goods, drop goods off to people nearby. We get all the businesses on board and set up to offer e-commerce, even at the most basic level, even just taking a telephone order and sending a PayPal link, as well as whatever level of e-commerce you can offer. Every business should now be offering distance selling, even if you're open. In fact, if you're open, it's almost more important because these convenience stores are becoming a kind of a petri dish for
Yeah.
the pandemic. And we need to get them offering better distance selling offering. And
Yeah.
obviously, if you're not open today, the government is encouraging businesses to still sell. You don't
Yeah.
have, you just got to sell through click and collect. You've got to sell through delivery. You've got to sell through online events. You've got to sell through distance, not just locally. So we're supporting councils around that.
Yeah.
And then I think it's going to become a really interesting conversation coming back to the property sector here around, what are the conditions for success for the retail property sector of the future? What does this need to look like?
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, you know what? Honestly, I think what you've just said there, I've been already crazy getting taking notes in so I can look back and refer back to them. So firstly, my thing is join the Save the High Street in order for the retailers to connect with you because you've got this very massive, like a support across the board. Um, Second thing is the local authorities. I was going to ask you that. Now that you're supporting the councils, shouldn't you be then eventually engaging with them in terms of this whole relaxing or planning laws or
Yeah.
that not do you understand what I'm saying? So that might be another strand for you to maybe delve into it deeper at some point and work with them to say, look, the face is changing, we need to change now or die. How do we now look at what change of use we can bring in planning policies, blah 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 blah.
100%. So, like, for me, a big focus of mine over the last 6 months prior to the pandemic kicking off was really starting to move forward on a lot of these areas. It was a big new phase in terms of our work here, and we're looking at all kinds of things. So, the reality is that the old world is not the future. We know that, yeah. And actually, the fact that this market has been breaking, for me, presents some of the great investment opportunities of our time. Because if we can now turn this round, there's all kinds of distressed assets on the high street, even more so because of coronavirus than before. Now,
Yeah.
what we need to then do is we need to work out what can we put in place to make sure retail property becomes a sexy asset class again that
Yeah.
generates great returns. Yeah. So there's certain principles that we've already outlined and we've been working on through here. So some of this is about a recognition that and I look at this from the outside. I come in here and I'm looking at this, and people have just accepted the planning legislation and norms as the norm. I look at it and say, well, a lot of this just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Firstly, it just takes way too long. So when it comes, and we're starting with some slightly larger projects, but it's interesting if people in the community are interested in on smaller scale. But what we're looking at is larger regen type projects. When we go in there, we're like, okay, right, there's a vision for this area. Yeah. How do we do like the Bracknell project? Yeah. But how do we do like, and there's loads all over the UK, larger regenerations of areas. How do we take somebody's vision and push it through the process much more quickly? How do
Yeah.
we put a stamp of approval on it? How do we endorse it? How do we support that vision? And how do we accelerate planning? So that's one side of things.
Yeah.
The second side of things is, if we look at, what's going to get the returns in the future, yeah. And I think we've got to recognize that a lot of the old ways aren't working. So a couple of the things we've done a lot of work on in the last years, how do we make performance-related rents work, yeah? How do we make it so that we can attract the right types of tenants to the properties that are out there, yeah, without asking them to outlay 100% of the rent, but actually reduce it, not 100% reduction, but a percentage, of the rent is reduced, and actually a percentage with the potential of bigger upsides,
Yeah.
yeah, is delivered as people have talked a lot about turnover rents,
Turnover rents.
even beyond turnover. What's the value of a business's footfall if we're measuring it? What's the value of a business's profits? What's the value of businesses' online sales that are influenced by that store? Yeah, so I'm really interested in starting to lay out a picture because we're in a position, we've built some of these assets where we track transparently a lot of these tenants. We get a real-time view of how they're performing and we're forecasting what we think they can be achieving. And as a result of that, what we need to get to is a point where there is the potential for landlords and tenants to be more of a partnership here, where the upsides are there, where the downside risks are reduced and you're working together. And it's sort of happened a little bit already. This isn't brand new stuff. So the big shopping centres have been forced into this, because nobody wants to go and move into the shopping centre unless there's a much more risk reward relationship, and the landlord, the owner of the shopping centre needs to invest to get footfall there. So there's already been played out that way. But we're
Very
seeing ways to play this out well across the market and start to play this back into the lenders and into the valuers. That's where it gets really important here, where the way that we value these things can't be the same as it was before. The big tenants, with the great covenants are not, so they are high risk. Yeah, the independents, with the low covenants are actually, in a lot of cases, the potential future. Everyone's seeing this as the future of the high street, and we need to represent that in the valuations. So there's that side of things. There's also the other side of things is the length of term. Yeah. So we need to find a way to get the economics working on a much more flexible lease type structure to attract the right tenants, get them in, get them to test the space. If it's working, great. Get them to double down, maybe make longer term commitments. But if not, get out, let them get out. Make it on both sides and bring somebody else in.
Yeah.
So this is something we're looking at here. Maybe we'll be interested to talking with agents and things like that as well, because we've got views here that it's kind of some of the learnings from the pop-up ecosystem need to be brought in across the high street, but make sure that works for everybody involved. And anyway, so there's a bunch of stuff.
Oh, that's huge. So how can I help? Because I know you've got to go and you've got times, like we've got couple more minutes left. Apart from people joining in the savethehighstreet.org and following you and people, what else can we do?
Well, I mean, I think a good starter, when you've got these couple of events you've got coming up as well. So to join there, and we can kind of outline a little bit more about some of the specifics. I mean, I think right now is people who are sort of open-minded and looking opportunistically at the retail property market. Firstly, I think positionally we've just got to get out the fact that it's dead. It's clearly not dead. It's not going anywhere. And the reality is there's going to be a hell of a lot of support to ensure that we have diverse, thriving high streets moving forward. So what we're going to be looking for in the next phase are forward-thinking, opportunistic developers and investors, as well as agents that want to get involved in all kinds of stuff as well. Because I think what we need to really do is we need to reinvent the high street, and in reinvention, there's going to be some of the great return opportunities out there. So I really think just getting the message out there about open-mindedness, that retail's not dead, it's just reinventing.
Absolutely. I think it's been a great, very exciting time, actually, to be fair. And I can see the passion in you that you really want to revive this. And everything that you've talked about is a lot to it. So, you're getting me excited as well. And, this whole thing about economics, changing the way you value a commercial property, because it's all based on the covenant. And that's completely changed now. So,
yeah.
But look at. I think the first point of call is I'm going to urge everyone on this call to join you guys, connect with you, and then hopefully we'll take it one step at a time. I'm looking forward for you to come and share this passion and your views on my next meeting. But thank you very much for taking the time today. And we will reconnect and very soon.
Thank you very much, Manny. Thanks for your time.